Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to open this session this morning on religion and the law, potentialities and limitations for engagement. This promises to be another great day, I think, of discussions on this really fascinating and really important topic. I'd also like to congratulate, of course, the conference organizers for putting all of this together and for bringing all of us together on this topic. My name is Julie Fraser. I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht University, and I also work in this space of religious norms and actors and international law. So I am very pleased to be here virtually with you all and with all of our expert panelists. We have a great lineup, as you can see here on the screen, of presenters and papers. First up is Dr. Jennifer Philippa Eggert, who is working with the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities at the University of Leeds. And her paper looks at countering violent extremism, humanitarian responses and faith, practical insights from a research capacity building project. Now, it's wonderful to have Jennifer with us right now, but I do understand she's going to sneak off early, so we're going to make the most of her presentation. Yeah, I'm pleased you can be here for this point in time, in any case. Second up, we have Dr. Miriam Abu Salem and Dr. Ludovica Decimo from the University Luigi Vanvitelli, who will be presenting their paper on religious declarations and humanitarian law. And our third presenters are Dr. Ahmed Al-Dawoody and Ms. Kelisiana Thynne from the International Committee on the Red Cross, who will be presenting their paper entitled Protection of the Natural Environment in Conflict under International Humanitarian Law and Islamic Law. Now, each of these papers, I'm sure I could fill a day, but I'm going to strictly limit everybody to about 10 minutes speaking time. And after that, I will abuse my position as chair to offer some reflections on the papers as presented. But we also definitely want input from all of our audience members and participants. So can I please invite you all to put comments, questions in the Q&A box as we go. And then at the end of the session, I'll pick out some of those to pose to our panelists. As I mentioned, even if Jennifer disappears, please still drop your comments in the Q&A box. She'll come back and follow up on those afterwards. So please don't deny her your insights there. So with that short introduction, I'm going to give the floor over to Jennifer for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie, and everyone who has been organizing the conference. It's so good to be here, even if I have to run off after my presentation, unfortunately. Okay, let me just start sharing my screen. Let's try this one. Nope.
These are also the joy of online conferences. But you got it to work. I can see that perfectly. But you are muted, Jennifer. So unless you're doing an interpretive dance performance, no, it's not. We'll need some sound.
Okay, it's saying that I can't. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes, yes, this is good. I can see you, hear you, and the presentation.
And you can see the presentation because it said I can't share my presentation while the audio is on.
Which is bizarre, but in any case, it seems to be working. I can see you and hear you and the presentation.
All right.
I'm just
you should
do this a slideshow maybe, and then we can see it bigger.
Yeah.
Or don't worry, please.
Yeah,
please.
yeah. Let's seize the moment and go with this.
No, yeah, it's not. I want. Oh, has this worked? Can you see? I'm so sorry, Julie.
No,
it's all you
okay.
because you said it's an online conference. And we just have one problem, and then all the others they just piled up. Oh my god. And I usually know how to do this after 2 years. Anyway,
no, but that's always Murphy's law, right? In the moment, it all goes wrong.
Yeah.
But no, please,
Yeah,
please continue.
Oh my god. Okay, so you can see my slides and you can hear me, and that's good. And yeah, I just jump straight into the presentation. I'm going to speak about countering violent extremism, or CVE for short, youth and faith in humanitarian settings. And this is not a very academic paper in the sense that, yes, I'm a researcher and I have the academic background, but in this paper, I'm really focusing on practical insights from a research capacity building project that we are working on at my organization. And just to clarify that before I start, so my position is jointly hosted by the University of Leeds and the JLI, the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, but that's a separate organization, that's an NGO. So I'm somewhere in between this space, like I'm everything and nothing and both at the same time. I'm a researcher and a practitioner and an academic, and that might be helpful for context as I go through the presentation. So in terms of what I want to speak about, very brief rationale for this kind of work, very brief overview of existing work in this area that I'm building on. I'll say a few words about context and methodology, share my reflections from practice, and then also look at some ways forward. So in terms of the rationale, this concept of CVE, of countering violent extremism, is around 20 years old. And it is sometimes presented as a better type of counterterrorism, right? So we have counterterrorism on the one hand, and that's military and coercive approaches. It's quite violent, actually, physically violent. If you look at what counterterrorism actors actually do in the field. And then on the other hand, you have CVE, which is supposed to focus more on dialogue, on reconciliation. It's supposed to involve civil society. But then this notion of CVE being a better type of counterterrorism has really been, no, what's happening? No. Oh, Zoom conferences. So this notion of CVE as being a better type of counterterrorism has really been questioned. And there are very strong criticisms. There are people who say that it's actually, it's reproducing global power asymmetries. It's based on racist and often Islamophobic assumptions. So the question that I want to ask here is, if this is the case, if the critics of CVE are actually right, are all of us who work on CVE, are we all complicit in these racist and Islamophobic and very exclusionary and violent as well practices? Is there a space for doing CVE differently? Is there a space for critical CVE? And giving these very strong criticisms, why do people from marginalized backgrounds, so people who might have a Muslim background, people of color, people from the global south, who are directly affected, negatively, very negatively affected in lots of cases by CVE, why do they still engage? There is quite a bit of literature out there that I'm building on. And one is the CVE, the literature on CVE that I've already mentioned. With quite strong criticisms on the effects, the impact of the war on terror on marginalized communities. There is also literature, a significant amount of literature on conflict, security, and development, with people warning of an increasing secularization of development spaces and development actors. Some, but not a lot, of literature on the intersection of CVE on the one hand and development and humanitarian action, mostly development really, on the other, who ask similar questions. So what does this increasing dominance of CVE frameworks and tools in development and humanitarian spaces, what does this do to the field, and how does this affect development actors? And then, because I'm also looking at face, the role of face and face actors more specifically, I'm also bringing in the literature on development, humanitarian action, and face. And there's a significant amount of literature that has developed in the last 20 or so years. And that is really calling for us to look beyond secular actors and secular frameworks and acknowledge that religious actors do play a role in pretty much all development in humanitarian spaces. Now, bringing all of these together, there's actually there's very, very little work that does that. So we have these different bodies of literature, but know very little about how CVE, development and humanitarian action, including conflict and security more broadly, and then as a third factor, face and faith actors, how these intersect. And that's really what I want to do in this paper. Now, to give a bit of context and speak a little bit about the methodology of all of this, is I'm partly building off my experience of working in these spaces for around 20 years now. And then I also largely refer to the work of the GLI, the NGO that I mentioned at the beginning that I work with, who is an international collaboration of researchers, academics, and practitioners, policymakers who work on faith as it intersects with development in humanitarian action and peace building. And DGLI mostly works with learning hubs, which are shared learning communities where people come together and learn about a specific topic with a focus on faith. And we had a peace and conflict learning hub for several years, where we looked at questions of faith, peace, and conflict as face, peace, and conflict, and produce the evidence for that. So we're doing research and sharing learning. CVE was only touched upon very lightly. So we still, God's sake, these slides, we still don't know a lot about that. We have a strong focus on research capacity building at the GLI. This is something that we're moving more towards, and this is part of a new initiative that we started last year that looks at how we can ensure that the evidence work and the knowledge production work and the shared learning that we do at the GLI with our partners from all over the world, how this can be done in more fair and equitable ways and really prioritize local actors. So this is the context that we're working in. And then we started working on the specific project that aims to build the research capacity of young people who work on CVE and religion with religious actors wherever relevant. This is a project that we are implementing with a European Development Agency, and where the aim is really to give these young people who are also based all over the world, a lot of them in Africa, but in other parts of the world as well, give them the tools to produce the evidence on these questions themselves, so that they can be owners of and experts on these questions, rather than just remaining on the margins, which a lot of young people and a lot of people from the global south tend to be, both in development spaces and in CVE spaces. Yeah, here are my reflections from practice. Then what have we found in this project so far? It's still ongoing, so we're nowhere near the end, and we're nowhere near having conclusive answers yet. But it does very much seem that CVE does indeed, CVE practices, CVE narratives, CVE discourse does very much reinforce global power asymmetries and racist narratives and structures and practices. So there is quite a lot of evidence for that. And I can't go into much detail now, but we could. There's numerous examples and quite a bit of literature that really illustrates that. So that, yeah, that's very strong evidence for that. Now, the first question that I wanted to ask was about, can we do CVE differently? Can there be a critical CVE? Can we do CVE that contributes to liberation, right? That is not complicit in these yeah, very, very problematic and exclusionary practices. And it's a tricky question, and it's a complicated question. If we're looking at it from a black and white perspective, we're not going to get very far. And there are people in this field, there are actors in this field who make a black and white decision and who are like, no, I'm going to stay away from CVE. I'm not going to engage because I just don't want to be complicit. But then on the other hand, we can also see, and I feel that our project is an example for that, that if your project is designed with a capacity sharing approach in mind, as our project is, that focuses on critical thinking and analyses, on community organizing, on empowerment and self-empowerment of the local actors that you work with, then there is at least an element of it in there. It's still not perfect. And on the mid and long term, you're still contributing to a perpetuation of these global power asymmetries, of these racist practices. There's no question about it. But maybe at the same time and on the more short term, you are actually building something more constructive. And that leads me to the last question that I asked in this paper is, why do people still engage? So yes, CVE is problematic if you look at the bigger picture, but there's an awful lot of people that engage and that are really enthusiastic about it. And I'm suggesting here that it's largely to do with two things. One is availability. So CVE is literally everywhere. It's it's been extremely successful in entering development and humanitarian spaces. There's lots of funding available, and it's just very difficult for local actors to avoid it. There are very strong incentives for people to engage. But that's only part of the story. The other part is that people are also dealing with an immediate, urgent problem. So yes, there are racist CVE practices and structures. You can see that very, very clearly. But that doesn't take away from the fact that political violence of non-state actors is a very real problem. And it's often people in the global south and from marginalized communities who feel that much more strongly than a lot of others. So they have very, very strong incentive, very strong reason to actually work on this. Now, what
can I ask just one more minute to wrap up?
Yeah, this is my last slide, and I'll do 30 seconds on the circle on the left and 30 seconds on the circle on the right. Yeah, and then this is literally my last point or question rather. How do we deal with this now? And what I see would work in practice, and what I feel is also an approach that lots of people are taking, is to look for the nuances, right? To get away from a very strict black and white approach, but instead to say, okay, what is the situation? We acknowledge the needs and priorities of all actors on all the various levels that we're engaging with or that we find ourselves on, right? And then we look at both short-term ways forward and then things that we work on the more mid and long-term. And short-term in this case would be to make sure that if we work on CVE, we include an element of of the things that I mentioned on the previous slide, right? So critical analyses, self-empowerment, capacity sharing, and so on. Because if people have these tools, they can take them wherever they deem fit, right? So even if you have a problematic CVE agenda, you don't have control over that afterwards. So people can even use that to criticize your practices. And at the same time, on the mid and long term, there is a need, a very, very strong need to also focus on the broader structures and addressing them, challenging them, and really dismantling them on the mid to long term.
Thank you very much. I do encourage people to pop comments, questions, thoughts in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that presentation. We are going to move straight on to Miriam and Ludovica. Please, I would like to give you the floor for your paper.
Thank you, Julie. Let me thank also the organization committee. It's a great pleasure to be here. Religion is often seen as a limitation to human development or as a factor of conflict. In reality, all religious denominations share the principles of solidarity, equality, and promote the unity and peace due to the common belonging to the human family. Faiths have an essential role in peacekeeping. For instance, they have provided emotional and spiritual support to war-affected communities, have mobilized their communities for peace, have mediated between conflicting parties, and have promoted reconciliation, dialogue, and disarmament. The impact of religions on the respect of human rights and humanitarian law could be ascribed to the fact that some of these principles are also identifiable within religious traditions. So the religious language can be considered as an effective tool in addressing human rights. Moreover, all faiths reject war as a method of resolving disputes and consider international humanitarian law as one of the finest and most effective expressions of the intrinsic demand of the truth of peace. With particular reference to Muslim world, we can say that it acts in two ways. On the one hand, Muslim community started an intra-religious discussion aimed at rediscovering the original religious message inspired by the criteria of equality, equity, and justice. An example of this is the Marrakesh Declaration on the Rights of Religious Minorities in Muslim-majority lands, signed by Muslim leaders and scholars in January 2016. The document is inspired by the Quranic principle of peace, solidarity, religious freedom, and human dignity. Its subscription became necessary because the condition of religious minorities in various parts of the Muslim world have deteriorated. In fact, religious minorities, despite having lived for centuries as a part of the fabric of Muslim societies and under the protection of state authorities, in an atmosphere of tolerance, mutual understanding, fraternity, today have been subject to killing, displacement, intimidation, and so on. Since these crimes are being perpetrated in the name of a distorted reading of Islamic principle, religious scholars have the duty to restore the true interpretation of religion by invoking the universal principles and comprehensive values of Islam. Among them, we can remember, for example, that the dignity belongs to all human beings, regardless of their race, color, language, or belief. This dignity requires that human beings must be granted freedom of choice. All people, regardless of their different nature, societies, and worldview, share the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood in humanity. Another important principle is that peace is the hallmark of Islam and the primary purpose of sacred love for society. Islam calls for treating others kindly, regardless of whether they share the same beliefs or not. And at last, we can remember that Islamic sacred law strongly emphasizes honoring contract, covenant, and convention, for that ensures peace and coexistence between peoples. For all these reasons, it is unconscionable to use religion as a false justification to aggress upon the rights of religious minority in Muslim lands. It is therefore necessary to guarantee equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their religious affiliation. The Marrakesh Declaration, for example, highlights how the mere attribution of the status of citizen is not itself sufficient to ensure an effective protection of religious minorities. Indeed, it is necessary to develop a concept of citizenship that includes religious and ethnic differences. On the other hand, Muslims became promoters of an interreligious cooperation. The dialogue with other faiths, especially Abrahamic ones, found its roots in the Quran, which states, and do not argue with people of scripture. In the cooperation process, an important role is assumed by the Forum for Promoting Peace, which aims to favor interconfessional coexistence and strengthen interreligious human values, such as peace, mercy, and justice by leaving aside ideological readings of Islam. A first and significant result of the cooperation process is the signing of declarations by religious leaders, which fix in the mutual and respectful dialogue the only way to peace, which must be followed by the faithful and by the civil community too. Now I give the floor to my colleague Ludovica Decimo, and she will introduce us some example of declaration.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm sorry for my bad English. I will try to speak slowly. So the first interreligious declaration is the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together. On 4 February 2019, Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar signed the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together. The document defines the cooperation between religions as an important instrument to ensure fundamental human rights. This document, in accordance with previous international documents, highlights the importance of the role of religion in the construction of world peace. Religious leaders, through this document, call upon the leaders of the world for, first goal, to work strenuously to spread the culture of tolerance and of living together in peace. The second goal is to intervene at the earliest opportunity to stop the shedding of innocent blood and bring an end to wars, conflict, environmental decay, and the moral and cultural decline. The second important interreligious declaration is the Charter of the New Alliance of Virtue. So, the New Alliance of Virtue is a faith-based organization, and it is the result of a long and fruitful interreligious dialogue. And at the same time, it represents an actualization of the historic Alliance of Virtue, stipulated in Mecca in the 7th century. So, the Charter of the New Alliance of Virtue, signed in Abu Dhabi in December 2019, claims that an alliance among people of all faith can help extinguish the flames of war and defeat the agents of terror and conflict. So this declaration identifies the alliance between the different religions is an instrument to bring out the positive values of religion, such as solidarity, fraternity, mutual understanding, and others, and therefore to stem armed conflicts. So, the conclusion. This religious declaration could affect peacekeeping and reduce religious or cultural conflicts, and also armed conflicts. So, in fact, they could be a key tool to facilitate the enforcement of humanitarian laws. How it is possible? Although religions documents are not legally binding, of course, so they are mandatory in the confessional legal system. The declarations are immediately understandable by political and legal institutions and therefore easily transformed in concrete tools for overcoming social and economic conflicts. Therefore, this may be the right way to ensure adequate protection of human rights and international humanitarian standards. For example, the Charter of the New Alliance of Virtue supports international agreements because they are a source of law, can contribute to global security, and they are an important tool for promoting peaceful cooperation between nations, despite different political, social, and economic systems. In this way, religions and faith-based cooperation, of course, become a precious allies of institution, national or international, organization, of course, and governments for the safeguard of all human rights and stemming armed conflict and the violation of humanitarian laws. I would like to conclude with my presentation, the presentation of Miriam Abu Salem, with a phrase from Pope Francis, that in his preliminary speech at the signing of Abu Dhabi Declaration, highlight that there is no alternative. We will either build the future together or there will not be a future. Very strong phrase. The time has come when religions should more actively exert themselves to help the human family deepen the capacity for reconciliation, the vision of hope, and the concrete pace of peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ludovica and Miriam, for that presentation. I think it's a really great topic and great to focus on these declarations. And I would just like to agree with Jennifer, who commented that, Ludovica, your English is perfect. Certainly no need to apologize. Yes, my students actually in class yesterday, we gave feedback to one another, and one of the students said to another student that you have a right to stand up and be heard just like everyone else, so take your space. I thought it was a lovely sentiment that applies to us all. I'm now going to apply it to Dr. Ahmed Al-Dawoody and his co-author, Kelisiana, Thynne. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julie, and many thanks to all the organizers for inviting us to present on this. Sorry, do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
yes, that's better. Thank you.
Sorry. Thanks, Julie, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting us to present on this topic of the protection of the natural environment under international humanitarian law and Islamic law. We have just all seen the negotiations at the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, and we all know that climate change is a huge problem globally. But when it comes to armed conflicts, the conflict-related natural environmental damage and the scarcity of the natural resources are exacerbating the conditions imposed by climate change and the humanitarian consequences of armed conflicts. And while this is a global problem, a number of Muslim majority countries have competing issues of climate and conflict-induced environmental change. Our paper provides examples from Afghanistan, Iran, Yemen, and Mali. So it is very timely to consider the laws that guide conduct in and against the environment in times of armed conflict under both IHL and Islamic law. what we seek to do in this paper is to outline the legal protections under both types of law and suggest how they can be implemented in practice to ensure real protection for the natural environment. And what we realized is that ultimately vigilance is the standard required by all commanders, government officials, and community leaders. And now I give the floor to Kelisiana to give a brief overview of the IHL aspects of our paper.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. On the IHL side, the ICRC 2020 guidelines on the protection of the natural environment in times of armed conflict provide a practical and humanitarian framework to ensure respect for the natural environment in armed conflict. It's generally recognized today that the natural environment is civilian in character for the purposes of IHL and in armed conflict, and therefore it has no military use prima facie and must be protected under the same rules which protect civilians in times of armed conflict. There are more detailed rules in relation to the specific protection of the natural environment under armed conflict, and some general rules which would generally protect the environment depending on how they are applied. Many of the rules specifically related to the environment are interconnected, as are indeed the rules relating to the protection of the civilian population. So some of the specific rules under IHL include restrictions on methods and means of warfare that might cause widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, the prohibition of using the destruction of the natural environment as a weapon, and the prohibition of attacking the natural environment by way of reprisal. The environment can lose its protection in times of armed conflict if it's used as a military objective. And here we see the example of date palms in Iraq, in indeed both IHL and Islamic law, where date palms were destroyed in modern times and in old times on the justification that they were used as a natural fortress. But in fact, their damage has long-term consequences for the environment, including water drainage and dried up farmland. IHL also imposes limitations on the types of weapons to be used. So in Iraq, again, unexploded remnants or remnants of war or anti-personnel mines have rendered land unusable and also harm wildlife. Booby traps, which are placed on animals, for example, are also prohibited under Protocol 2 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And it's interesting that the protection of animals is in one area where there's a distinct overlap between IHL and Islamic law. So having given a very brief overview of the IHL aspects, I'll turn to Ahmed again.
Thanks, Kelisiana. Islamic law provides a set of rules that supports the civilian character of the natural environment, as you just mentioned. And any damage to the natural environment, whether during peacetime or during armed conflict, which is not required by imperative military necessity, falls under the Quranic description fasad fi al-ard, which literally means destruction or mischief in the land. And by the way, this is one of the descriptions of the crime of terrorism under Islamic law. And Prophet Muhammad prohibited cutting down trees except those that block the Muslims from engagement in the fighting, and prohibited destruction of houses. And following the same logic, the first Caliph Abu Bakr died 634 Common Era, gave the well-known 10 instructions to his army commander Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, which includes, quote, do not cut down fruit-bearing trees or destroy buildings. Do not slaughter a sheep or a camel except for food. Do not burn or drown palm trees. Do not loot. End of quote. So additionally, there are indications from the earliest periods of Islamic history that the Islamic State practice have recognized the civilian character of the natural environment, and therefore it shall not be treated as a military objective unless required by imperative military necessity. Simply and additionally, from a pure utilitarian perspective, medieval Islamic State practice would not normally resort to wanton destruction of the natural environment and enemy property because of the customary practice for enemy positions to be seized as war booty in international armed conflicts. Similarly, the protection of the natural environment is regulated under the discussion of the prohibition or permissibility of using certain indiscriminate means and methods of warfare. For example, Muslim jurists deliberated since the 7th century the use of indiscriminate weapons such as mangonels, i.e. catapults, and weapons tipped with poison, fire, or oil, because when shot at enemy fortifications and strongholds, they might poison water sources and vegetation and would lead to the destruction of civilian objects and the killing of humans and livestock. And now I give the floor to Kelisiana for the conclusion.
Thanks very much. The few examples that we studied in this paper, and Ahmed has outlined some of them, show that the rules developed by 8th century Islamic jurists and 21st century IHL guidelines affording protection of the natural environment could and indeed can improve the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict in their respective contexts, but mostly depending on how they are implemented. So states and non-state armed groups, whether in control of territory or not, and with the support of Islamic law experts and religious leaders, have the ability to improve the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict in their respective contexts. So some ways that they could do this is planning with the environment in mind. So they should assess both the immediate and long-term impact of their actions on the natural environment. And we're talking about direct and indirect impact. They should deliberate on the choice of weapons and the means and methods of warfare and their effect on the environment. They should implement international laws or interlocal regulation, both Islamic law and IHL. And obviously governments are the primary target of this, but those groups that can control territory should also be making sure that they implement relevant laws. And there should be continued dialogue related to the contemporary IHL challenges in Muslim context with Islamic governments, Islamic academics, researchers, regional and international fatwa institutions, frontline Muslim negotiators, and Islamic arm carriers. Ultimately, there is a due diligence standard, which others have spoken about in this conference, and it is required in environmental protection as well as in international humanitarian law. So there must be vigilance and oversight by government, community leaders, and others with authority. They should be aware of the law around the natural environment. They should promote it, uphold it, and sanction anyone who doesn't abide by it. So if governments and other leaders supported by IHL and Islamic law experts and religious leaders can step up and exercise the vigilance required of them under both types of law, then the environment might be better protected in times of armed conflict, and we would see a mitigation and reduction of the damage caused by conflict as exacerbated by climate change. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. My timer is just going off, which means your timing was perfect. Very well done. Thank you both for that presentation. It's now my turn to comment a little bit on some of these papers as presented, and I would just like to encourage again our audience members to pop questions in the Q&A box as I do that, which I'll then raise some of the questions and then go back to all of our panelists to reflect on some of the issues raised. I'm going to start my reflections for Jennifer in absentia, of course. But Jennifer, I liked your paper a lot, and I like this focus, particularly the practitioner focus you bring to this issue of humanitarian practices. And in your presentation, you noted that there was a general reluctance to engage with religion and religious actors across both the development and humanitarian spaces. And you suggested that this had something to do with the idea of impartiality or neutrality within humanitarian circles, and that there was perhaps a fear of being denied access if one is perceived to not be neutral. And I wondered what sources you had for those suggestions, and also what other reasons there might be for this reluctance. I wonder if it's also not related perhaps to the suspicion of culture and especially religion in international law more generally. So not just humanitarian law, but also here I'm thinking about human rights law, for example. Also, the fact that you mentioned the donors funding the sort of work that you're researching, and also the fact that many Western donors perhaps didn't want this sort of intervention or were suspicious or skeptical of these particular actors. And I wonder if this also goes back to perhaps the West's priority for secularism or secular neutral engagement in these sorts of spaces. You also mentioned that one of the aims of the JLI is to develop research capacity building in terms of CVE. And you talked about the methodology that you were going to use in your paper and for this capacity building. And I wonder if you will explicitly adopt a decolonial method that really focuses on decentering Western epistemologies and also focuses on the co-production of knowledge. I think that could be really interesting for you to use in the method of your research itself. I also then had a question about the explicit link to law in your paper, because of course our topic today is looking at religion and law, both religious law, but also international law. And I wondered if you were going to elaborate upon that in the paper itself. But I also wondered whether that mattered, whether you needed to have an explicit link to law or whether you were going to really focus on law in practice, and therefore it wasn't something that you needed to look at. I thought that was something you could perhaps expand upon. Okay, moving on then to the second paper, Miriam and Ludovica. I really liked the topic of your paper. I think it's a really great idea to focus on these religious declarations. And in your presentation, you looked at and gave some really great examples of these declarations. And the fact that they also refer explicitly to things like human rights. Several different rights were explicitly mentioned, as well as concepts like human dignity, which is a foundation, of course, of human rights law, but also the principle of, human dignity is also very important in international humanitarian law. So here again, you see the sort of mixing of the sacred and the secular. But I wondered specifically about international humanitarian law and whether you were also going to draw out specific comparative analysis here between the declarations and international law norms, specifically IHL norms. Also in that comparative analysis, will you also compare explicitly the religious norms themselves? So both in papers that are, declarations that are just amongst Muslim groups, whether you're going to look there at whether there's any contestation between Islamic norms, or also then between, say, Christian norms and Islamic norms. So really drawing about a bit more comparative analysis there within religious norms and also then vis-a-vis the international norms. The final 2 points I had for you relate to operationalization. The declaration put out by the Pope and the Grand Imam, which Ludovica, you mentioned, in that they call for the declaration to be distributed to religious leaders, international organizations, civil society, etc., and that it should be translated into policies, legislation, courses of study, etc. I found this really impressive, that they really sort of mapped out what they want done with the declaration. And I wonder if this has happened. The declaration was put out in 2020. I wonder if we have seen it taken up in any places. Has it been translated? Has it been disseminated? And has it been actually taken up by some of these communities of faith, but also civil society organizations and international or other organizations? Now, I do notice, of course, that COVID started in 2020, so perhaps COVID's also impacted this dissemination. But I think I'm keen to see how it has been operationalized in practice. And the final point here I wanted to raise was you mentioned in your presentation that the declarations are not binding, but that they do have this sort of mandatory role within the confessional system. And I wondered again here how that actually works in practice, what sort of enforcement mechanisms there are, in that confessional system, whether there's any added value to the enforcement systems or lack thereof in international law, and also to what extent you see a deviation in practice from the religious norms as stated. Of course, there are always, standards professed, but in practice, then there's usually a range of practice that complies to varying extents with the stated norms. But thank you very much for that paper and for those ideas. I'm going to finally shift then to the paper by Ahmed and Kelisiana. Also really great topic. I think it's crucial to focus on the environment, especially in today's context of conflict, but also particularly the climate crisis, which you framed your presentation with. I also really like this topic too, because I think it really shows the breadth of topics covered by both IHL and Islamic law. And Islamic law itself is a really rich resource in relation to environmental protections. This applies both in times of conflict as well as in peace times. And there is, in fact, a revival of discussion relating to Islamic environmental law. And I wanted to refer you perhaps to this book, which came out just this year by Cambridge University Press, which looks precisely at rediscovery and revival in Islamic environmental law. So this isn't specific to IHL, but rather maps out more broadly some of the jurisprudence in Islamic law that relates specifically to the environment. There are some really exciting ideas here that relate to eco-fatwas and eco-jihad, which certainly for me are really exciting concepts. Also in your presentation, you spoke about the protection of animals, and this also had me thinking about the definition of environment, which you also visit in your paper itself. But I wonder to what extent animals are included within the definition of environment within Islamic law, but also international law. And I know that there is also a forthcoming volume dedicated to the protection of animals in conflict. That's also going to be coming out with Cambridge University Press. I feel like now I'm just a saleswoman for Cambridge, but anyway, this is an interesting book that's supposed to be out this coming year. So that's perhaps also something that you could look at in your research too. I doubt they have anything that relates specifically to Islamic law. So perhaps you could also draw from that and reflect on it from the Islamic perspective. Your paper also gives really excellent illustrations of the Islamic protections. But I also really liked your differentiation between the protection of the environment from various weapons, like the incendiary weapons that you mentioned. But I also really liked the idea of the use of the environment itself as a weapon. I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition there. So my final thought for you is also perhaps to engage with the idea of ecocide. This, of course, is also now very topical. There's been a proposed definition of ecocide now, and there's some movements in international criminal law specifically to also recognize ecocide as an international crime. That would then be a standalone crime, so not necessarily tied to war crimes. But I wondered if that was also relevant to your paper and something that you could also reflect on, given the movement now around that concept. I hope I also stuck to my own 10 minutes. And I am now going to give the floor back to our presenters to reflect on some of these issues. Audience members, please drop your comments and questions in the Q&A. And I guess I'm going to go, in the absence of Jennifer, back to Miriam and Ludovica, if you would like to respond to any of those ideas raised. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for your comments. So sure, we will in the future analyze also the perspective of other religions group about this topic, and also we want to understand, want to analyze if and how Muslim countries, for example, signed the document of humanitarian law with the reserve. I don't know if it's correct, this term. So we will do this.
Thank you for your suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, then I'm going to turn to Ahmed and Kelisiana for any responses.
Kelisiana, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Julie, for those great comments. Maybe I'll just focus, mindful of the time, on the protection of animals, as you say. I think in our paper we do sort of throw a few ideas of protection of animals throughout it, because in fact it's really striking how there's quite a lot of protection of animals in Islamic law, but also in IHL. And so I had seen that book was going to be coming out, so I'm really going to look forward to reading about the animal protection in conflict. But indeed, in terms of the definition of the natural environment, there's no actual agreed definition of environment under international law, but basically the ICRC guidelines have said that it's the natural world together with living organisms and their inanimate environment. And it goes on to include fauna as well as flora and oceans and rocks and soil. So I mean, pretty much anything that's living or indeed inanimate in the environment is protected. And so I would include animals in that. And particularly because the civilian character of the environment is quite a lot focused on how civilians interact with the environment. And in that regard, livestock, it becomes very important. And when we see the effects of climate change, then we see that quite often it's that livestock is dying because of heat, or they don't have enough water to irrigate land. There's quite a lot of focus on the protection of agricultural land and including livestock. And so in the protection of the environment under international humanitarian law, I would also suggest that there should be a considerable protection of animals within that. Then I think there was one other point that I thought of. Oh, ecocide. Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the topic that's coming up very much now. I think that the International Law Commission is engaging on it. And I think certainly it deserves a mention in our paper, because indeed we do call for sanctions if there is damage to the natural environment. And the ecocide definition is including the similar definition to the widespread long-term damage to the natural environment. And certainly under if it becomes a topic of international criminal law that can be prosecuted against individuals, then that would be something that we should definitely look at including. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ahmed.
Thanks, Julie, for your valuable thoughts, and also for the important sources that you directed us to. I think we will look at them and hopefully include them in when we try to improve the paper. But I also would comment on the aspect of animals, and it is indeed remarkable to see that 7th, 8th, 9th centuries Muslim jurists were deliberating on this issue from the perspective of regulating Muslim conducts during armed conflict, in terms of what is haram, prohibited, and in terms of what is halal, permissible. But also, interestingly, they make this distinction between animate and lifeless objects, because causing any incident, any harm to animals would be considered as a kind of torture, and at some point also would be considered as a kind of mutilation, which is prohibited under Islamic law. And we have seen some of in the instructions of the first Caliph Abu Bakr's instruction to his army leader, something like this. But at the same time, also they differentiated between the use of animals as a military objects. For example, when it comes to horses, they permitted targeting horses if the enemy mount on them during fighting. So in this case, it becomes like a kind of a military object, and only in this case they can be targeted. So it is interesting to see this these deliberation about the protection of animals, but also on the environment in general, because from an Islamic worldview, everything in this universe is the creation of God, and causing any unnecessary damage that's not dictated by the military necessities is considered as a kind of wanton destruction, which was I was a bit astonished to see a Syrian 8th century jurist, famous jurist with the name of Al-Dawoody, that equates it with the crime of terrorism if wanton destruction is committed in the battlefield. So yes, that's a bit interesting, and we will also at some point need to we can include some of the new references that you have referred to, because this is a growing area of interest among Muslim scholars. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I should note I'm not getting commissioned from Cambridge to sell their books. We have some questions in the chat now, which I am going to pose to all of our panelists that are here. I think they apply broadly. We have questions by Kulud, which I'm going to read the first one. Acknowledging the existence of an Islamic foundation to protect the environment in times of war directly and indirectly, how do you assess the success of Islamic jurisprudence and scholars in keeping up to date with the change of warfare and addressing the protection of the environment in today's armed conflicts? And the second question, which again, I'm going to pose to everybody here, looks at how we can properly engage with religious leaders in the case where there are certain malleable and flexibilities in the use of fatwas and how they are interpreted by different armed groups. So I think this also applies to the paper by Miriam and Ludovica, also because they're looking at these declarations that are made up of different interpretations. And so I think the point goes back sort of more broadly to the issue of differing interpretations within all of these religious schools of thought and how they are debated, and how these texts are actually produced in terms of the declarations, but also in terms of the paper on environmental law, how we decide what differing interpretations to privilege or how to implement those in practice. Ahmed, can I go straight to you?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for Khulud for the question. Yes, I second what you have said on the Islamic legal foundations for the protection of the environment. But in answer to your question about how successful, if I understand your question rightly, the modern Islamic scholars or jurists, my answer would be a bit disappointing. I would say it is not adequate yet, because there is a kind of a gap between the theory and the practice. For certain cultural reasons, there is now a kind of a divide between the realm of the theory, scholarship, and between the realm of reality on the ground. And this is why I think the engagement and the dialogue between Islamic academics, professors, jurists, fatwa institutions, with humanitarian organizations, or with those who have expertise and knowledge about the realities of armed conflicts on the ground. This will be a two-way learning process for the two worlds to know about each other and find common ways at the end of the day to enhance compliance and respect of IHL, and in this case, this specific example, to ensure the protection of the environment. And there are so many tools like expert workshops, like fatwas, but whether this is relevant to state or non-state actors, but there is a distinction between the state and non-state actors. The state actors, they have the international law IHL regime, which is mandatory on globally. For certain Islamic non-state armed groups, if they are unwilling to abide by it, so I think it is pragmatic that they develop codes of conduct even if based on Islamic law, but at the same time cannot be in contradiction with IHL, because by the end of the day, both types of law have the same objectives.
Kelisiana, did you want to jump in there?
The issue of code of conduct, maybe doing my own spruiking of different publications, and once again, it's a Cambridge one, sorry. But our colleague Thibault de la Bourdonnier has just written an article, it's just been published actually in the International Review of the Red Cross, on engaging non-state armed groups on the protection of the natural environment. And in that, he proposes a model code of conduct or a model declaration for the protection of the natural environment that non-state armed groups can sign up to. So I think that actually ties some of the questions together, and also our two presentations together quite well. So this is a declaration that non-state armed groups might be asked to sign to protect the natural environment.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ludovica and Miriam, I wanted to come back to you also in terms of declarations in this idea of competing interpretations. And I wondered if you knew how, or you looked at how the declarations were also made, or whether you started from the declaration itself and then worked onwards. I wondered if you had insights as to how those different interpretations were negotiated in the drafting phase.
Okay, no, we started from the beginning. So how the religious communities started the discussion about this declaration. For example, in the Charter of the New Alliance, there is a little difference between the Arabic version and the English one, because in the English, in the draft paper, it's recognized the religious freedom, as everybody knows in the Occidental perspective, while in the Arabic one, no. And this one, there was in the draft paper, but in the final English declaration, it has disappeared, for example. And it's interesting to analyze, for example, the story of Forum for Promoting Peace, also because it tried to manage difference of religion, starting from the everybody belongs to human family. Starting from this, they try to overcome religious differences that are naturally began to all religions.
Ludovica, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm agree with Miriam, and we will depend the different interpretation of religious declaration, and especially interreligious declaration, also on the basis of a different religious norm, Muslim norms, Christian norms, and for other religions. And in the paper, we will depend this argument.
Can I ask which other religions? Do you look at sort of Abrahamic faith? So I'm assuming Judaism. Do you anything else?
Oh, only Abrahamic religions, but we can extend the research to other religions.
Yeah, no, the Abrahamic faiths are sort of easier to link together. Okay, I am going to come back to Ahmed and Kelisiana with another question that actually wants to probe your research a little bit more specifically in relation to Mali, and whether you could expand a little bit on the research that you did specifically relating to environmental protections in the conflict in northern Mali. And whether you can give examples of particular fatwas or negotiations brokered by religious actors about the environmental protections there. Of course, the project today, Generating Respect, has also looked at the situation of Mali. And so they're particularly interested to any additional insights you have there from that context.
Well, maybe I'll start in terms of the, so obviously my focus is much more just on IHL and certainly from the ICRC's perspective, we likewise discovered that environmental protection is a huge concern in Mali, both climate change, but also as an ongoing driver of the conflict. And one of the points that we note in the paper is that attacks on government and local officials actually meant that they were unable to uphold rules related to the protection of the environment. So it's interesting that there's both indirect effects of the conflict, or indiscriminate attacks can actually lead to lack of environmental protection. Another example is that farmers can't access their fields, herders aren't able to feed their livestock. Basic infrastructure such as water isn't able to be fixed and improved in Mali as a result of the conflict, and so that's really exacerbating it. So those are the challenges there, and we certainly from an IHL perspective, we work with the government and with relevant non-state armed groups, urging the protection of the environment, and also providing actually practical support in terms of supporting infrastructure and water production, water maintenance. But Ahmed, do you want to talk a bit about anything on the Islamic side?
I think, Kelisiana, you have mentioned everything. Nothing very specific from my side to add to this, but in a dialogue or with many interlocutors whom Islamic law discussion is relevant, this is one of the issues that we do tackle, not only us but many other organizations and scholarly debates like this. This is one of the issues that arise, of course, but nothing further in terms of concrete examples apart from what you have mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, the Mali case study is a really rich case study in relation to a range of different issues in humanitarian law, but also international criminal law, of course. So we can talk about that for quite a lot longer. We have a few minutes left, so I do want to raise this last question that really looks at how we can properly engage with religious leaders in the case where there are malleable and flexible use of fatwas and how they're interpreted by different armed groups. It sort of relates to the earlier question that was posed. But I want to look specifically here about the different armed groups and this sort of choice that there is between which interpretations to follow. I think certainly in Catholicism, of course, with the Pope, there's a more hierarchical setting. But of course, in Islam, that's perhaps not quite the same. So I wondered if both groups wanted to share any thoughts they have about these flexible interpretations and the choice that armed groups have in deciding which fatwas they are going to privilege and prioritize, and how that can perhaps be addressed in terms of actually implementing also protective norms. Can I give the floor to Miriam or Ludovica first? For any final comments. Ludovica. Miriam.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, the question was just about the malleability or the contesting fatwas that are sometimes put out by different religious leaders, and how different armed groups have the ability to essentially forum shop between these different interpretations and choose which interpretation they will apply. And I wondered if you've also seen this in terms of the declarations that you've looked at, whether or not specific armed groups uphold different declarations and how they choose which ones they will follow or not.
Armed groups do not apply declarations at all. They don't consider them.
That's a very interesting answer in and of itself. Ahmed and Kelisiana, can I throw to you then for any final thoughts or comments on this question or topic more broadly?
If I may start, I think we need first to look at the definition of fatwa itself, because maybe in the Western culture, the word fatwa has some kind of connotations that might not actually reflect the true nature of the term fatwa itself. The term fatwa is defined as a non-binding legal opinion. So it is a response to a question, and it is basically the results of the one who did the Islamic legal scholarly effort to provide an answer to a specific question. And this is why no one who would issue the fatwa would say that this is 100% conclusive. No, they would say that this is my own interpretation, and in terms of its application, for example, or enforcement, it is left to either to the court if the state would adopt such a kind of interpretation when it comes to implementation on a state level, or it is left to the choice of the Muslim individual if they would choose this, if it comes on a personal level. But when it comes to the context of non-state armed groups, of course, it would depend first and foremost on the framework of or the background or the identity of those who or the person who issued this fatwa. Are they credible to them or not? Are they more closer to their line of thought or not? And by the way, fatwa could be a more recent one, or it could be borrowed from centuries ago. So by the end of the day, it would be left to the one who would implement this fatwa, whether it is a state or non-state actor. In terms of the malleability or misuse of certain fatwas, there is no option, and this happens in any context or any legal system. Of course, there are deliberations and agreement and disagreement. There is nature, of course, and the only solution here is just to engage in dialogue and try to see which arguments are more convincing, depending on the context and the objective of the law itself. Thanks.
Ludovica, is that a hand?
Thank you, Julia, for your suggestion, but I would like to point that religious declaration and also the interreligious declaration promote positive values of religion, peace, fraternity, solidarity, and oppose to all forms of violence. So the importance of this declaration is that they are immediately understandable by the faithful and also by the confessional legal system. The impact is very, very important, and this declaration can help in the fight against the armed conflict, especially in religious legal system, such as Muslim country, of course, but also in other country and such as secularized country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that and for those insights and discussions. I really look forward to further conversations with you all and to the next session of our conference. A round of applause, please, for all of our presenters, including Jennifer. And I am going to, I think, throw back to our organizers for perhaps a short break, which perhaps I've eaten into already.